Yeah. Hi, Hamada. How are you?
Good, Razvan. Thank you for having me on this show. I've been
So,
following NomadMania for a long time, so I'm really excited to be able to have the opportunity to speak with you.
I love to talk about travel, and I believe that this will be a great conversation. So I'm looking forward to it. I would like to ask you, can you tell something a bit about yourself? How did you get into travel? Where does this love for travel come from?
So I think the best way to kind of answer that is the fact that I wasn't able to travel as much as I had wanted to when I was a child, and the reason for that is my family is from Iraq, and being Iraqi, and I was born around 1970, 1980, just at the start of the Iran-Iraq War. Traveling was somewhat restricted. I was born in Switzerland, grew up there until I was about three or so, and then traveled throughout the Middle East, and then ended up in America, largely as I guess a kind of an immigrant. I wouldn't say a refugee, but an immigrant in the United States around 1984, 1985. And I think from that period through to when I finally got the U.S. passport in 1997, even though I traveled, it was very restricted. And having someone tell you you cannot travel, or you have to have visas, or you have to stay in this transit lounge and you can't exit the airport, things like that really were frustrating. And I remember as a child, my dad teased me because he put up a huge map on the wall with all the flags and all the countries as a map. And I memorized it. And I kind of really wanted to slowly but surely start to see it. And I couldn't. And even though I was young, I still obviously couldn't even get to these places. And so I think when I got the US passport, when I was around 17 years old, I decided never to take traveling, or I guess the freedom of mobility, for granted. And I think that was a very, very important part and start to my desire to see the world. That being said, I don't know if anybody starts off, or maybe they do, I want to see the world. I think people start off saying, I want to travel. And then one travel becomes two, two becomes four, 6 countries, 8 countries. Then you start doing things a little bit differently. You're outside of Europe. You're in more, difficult countries to travel to. And I would say probably around my mid 20s is when I realized, hang on a second, I'm onto something. I love doing this. I love speaking about it. I love learning about people's experiences. And that's really when I started to taking traveling more proactively, let's say. And I would say through my late 20s into my 30s, that's when I really was pushing it very hard.
Oh, nice. And at that time you were in the US, I understood, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I largely I studied. I think a lot of my life has been around my studies. So I did a lot of graduate degrees, and part of my studies I studied abroad. I also studied in England and did a master's there. And so even though I was based in the U.S. on East and West Coast, I also lived abroad, studied abroad, worked abroad as well.
Can you mention where?
So I did the master's in Sure, I did the master's in England. I studied abroad in Spain, and then I would spend significant times in the Middle East as well. And I did that as well. Yeah.
So I understood right. You're born in Switzerland, correct? After
Yes,
that,
exactly.
for how long were you living there for, and you still had Iraqi citizenship at that point?
Exactly. Yeah, my father worked for the United Nations, and so I lived in Switzerland for just under 3 years. And then we started traveling, kind of moving around to different places. We went to Egypt, Tunisia, then we moved to America, and then from America we actually moved back to Egypt when I was 10 years old, and we lived there for 8 years, largely because, again, given the situation with Iraq, especially during the sanctions, the first Gulf War, the sanctions, the second Gulf War, my father really wanted us to be raised speaking Arabic, learning about our religion, Islam, and really kind of seeing the world, at least internationally, at least even if we were just in Egypt, seeing people who were international. And I think that was extremely, extremely formative in my life because I went to an international school. In fact, I went to The Hague. I remember was one of my first trips ever with my U.S. passport because we did the Model United Nations, as you may remember. Next to the International Court of Justice, we did the MUN conference there when I was 18, and I still remember that as such an incredible immersion into understanding people from different backgrounds as part of the UN, so to speak.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I don't recall because I'm actually here for just the last 8 years or so, 8 or 9 years, and I'm
Okay.
not Dutch originally, but this city is international beyond expectation. I think more than 50% of the inhabitants are from outside, are born outside of the
Exactly.
Netherlands. So yeah, it's a very interesting environment. Well, I was curious. I mean, like you already been through a ton of countries already by your 18th birthday. I can imagine that was really interesting, and also being immersed in the life, from these countries. I mean, it was not only traveling, but actual living there. I think. Can you recall a particular memory or some interesting stories from that time?
Well, I mean, even though I had lived in Egypt, and I probably by the time I was 18 had traveled to maybe 10 countries. Again, like I said, it was very difficult because everything before then we had to get visas, and if we were lucky. And I'll give you one memory that really stuck in my head. Um, I remember very distinctly. I was in California for the summer. I was 15 years old, and my father had just traveled from California, where he was with us, to Egypt, where he was waiting for us. And I was heading back to Egypt to start schooling or to restart high school. And I remember it was the first time I was ever traveling by myself. Um, and I was traveling from Los Angeles to New York to Vienna, Vienna to Cairo. And I remember getting to New York and going to the boarding gate, and I showed her my Iraqi passport at the boarding gate to get on my flight to go to Vienna, and then from Vienna to head off to Cairo. And I remember getting to the boarding gate, and the lady said, "I'm sorry, where's your transit visa?" I said, "I'm only in Vienna for 2 hours in a transit hall and then heading off to Cairo." She's like, "I'm sorry. Unfortunately, Iraqis now require you to have a visa to transit in the country." Imagine the craziness. All you're doing is landing, going to a
Yeah,
transit hall in the airport, waiting, getting on another plane, getting out. And you needed a visa for that, as if I was going to jump out of the airport. So I said, "I don't have one." She said, "Unfortunately, we can't have you go through Vienna." So next thing you know, I'm flying through. They spin the globe. They look to see where an Iraqi can go. And they found that I'm allowed to travel to Morocco and stay in their transit hall and wait for a flight to go to Cairo. And so that's what I did. So next thing I'm calling my father from the airport in Morocco, telling him that they pushed me onto another flight in another country. I had to wait about 15 hours there in the transit hall. They wouldn't let me leave into the main airport. I had to stay in like a small area. And then finally, I arrived 2 days later to Cairo. My dad was so upset. My bag had arrived. It was lost. It was torn open. It was a disaster. And again, I felt like a pariah. I felt like a rejected individual because I was born with this passport and this
yeah,
country. And because of what was happening at the time, and it was sanctions, I felt like a complete outsider. And I think those are the kind of moments that really kind of stuck in my head when I travel, when I meet people from other countries, when I understand immigration problems and refugee flows. And I said to myself, I'll never take this for granted. And that's why, again, when I got the US passport 2, 3 years later, it's unbelievable because everybody at that point was so kind and generous. Oh my God, he's an American, saluting you and so forth. So very, very different life experience simply because of a document.
yeah. Such a huge difference. And as we speak now, I mean, there are a ton of travelers that with low index passports that really struggle, I believe.
Yeah.
And if you look at their countries, I mean, country count, or the places they've been, or all the things that basically they traveled, it's even more remarkable what they achieve, with this
It's
I can imagine that.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. I've seen, to your point, the four worst passports in the index you mentioned is Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. And there are some people that I've noticed, Iraqis, who are trying to see as much of the world. And I'm like, I have no idea how you do it. Because for me, every time I have to apply to a visa, for a visa with a US passport, it's such a pain, right? We take it so for granted. Oh, I've got to submit a picture of my passport. I've got to do all kinds of things like that. And it's just incredibly frustrating. So what I ended up doing is it just gets very, very frustrating to kind of figure that out.
Hey, sorry, this is my daughter. Hey, can you poți că avem treabă? Ok. Nu știu. Sorry to interrupt, but maybe we can, we will be able to cut this at the editing. But I mean, it's obviously very interesting to hear about this, and I've seen now briefly the LPI passport and yeah, like you mentioned, it was very very difficult, and the humiliation that people go through. I think only to basically just go maybe even to a neighboring country is not even let's say a Western hemisphere country or. But I believe that I don't know. I mean, it was a rather short period of time, maybe while also that you use this passport, or I mean, throughout the travels. I believe you already have encountered some stories throughout.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean so again, like when we got the U.S. passport, things were very, very different. Obviously, getting visas, I think in America, I think in terms of that index, maybe it's the 10th most easiest country to get visas on arrival, which made my life infinitely easier to see as many of the countries in the world as I have in the last 15 to 20 years.
Yeah. May I ask you, what's your style of travel? I'm curious to see. I mean, also maybe a bit about yourself first, to see if
Sure.
you have a ton of free time and how many days a year maybe you travel and so on, and then also dig in a bit of your style and how do you prefer to do it.
To travel. Sure. So I know that I think you guys, this is a digital nomad month as well, or something to that effect. I think for me, my ability to travel is also facilitated by the fact that I could work, almost all my work is remote. As I said, I went to a lot of graduate schools. I'm a lawyer by background, so it allows me to do legal work from almost anywhere that I go. And also, I own a admissions consulting business that helps students in terms of their academic ability. Applying to academic programs, especially college and undergraduate graduate programs. Around the world, and so that also gives me flexibility. So my style has been to kind of intersperse work with my travel, as in when I'm traveling, I can work from almost anywhere. I try to keep my trips to about 2 weeks max. Largely because I have family here in California, and I feel like if I start traveling, I'm never going to come back. I'm constantly going to be on the road. So I have to constantly remind myself that I have an anchor, and the anchor is coming back to California so I can be with my family. And also just in terms of work in general, I want to kind of be stationary here. So I'm not one of your classic vloggers traveling around the world for 6 to 10 months or a year. I don't do that. I try to do it in spurts. Go for 2 weeks. It keeps me very efficient, and I try to do it very intentionally. And I can't say that was the case before. Before, in my 30s, I was working with the US government as an international lawyer, doing international development. And so I traveled constantly for the US government, living in Washington, D.C. And I would travel and do, while I'm in like a country, let's say, I'll get, a good example, let's say was, I went to Malaysia. And from Malaysia, I used it as a base to go to Nepal and then back to Malaysia, then to go to Singapore, then back to Malaysia, then go to Brunei, then back to Malaysia, right? While I'm in that region. And then I kept doing that for other countries. Like I went to Georgia, then drove to Armenia, and then flew to Azerbaijan, right? So I kind of used my travels with the US government and then would use it to pivot off other places and then keep it within 2 to 3 days. But a lot of my travels, I have to say, prior to COVID, were much more go into the country, quickly see it, and leave. Still get the experience, but just kind of in and out. During COVID is when I came up with my brand, Final50, which I suddenly realized as I was driving around, I was doing a lot of road trips during COVID. And I live in Los Angeles. So thank God for us here. We could go to, within about a day, you can travel to by car to like 10 different national parks. So I was constantly going to different national parks because I couldn't travel abroad. But I realized as I was driving that I was getting very close to the final 50 countries on Earth. I was at about 146 countries or something like that. So I was like, wow, I'm getting really close. So then I suddenly came up with this idea of creating Final 50 to document my life experiences as I travel. When I started to document it, and I can show you in terms of I'm not sure if I can share my screen, but you can see right here, I created this channel called Final50, and it became something like a very intentional life experience. And so for the last 2.5, 3 years since I created the account, I started kind of filming all the different places I would go to, much like a travel vlogger would, with using 3 kind of pillars, which are called the 3 E's: education, entertainment, and exploration. Mind, body, and soul, right? So education was really learning about everywhere I went, right? And because I'm a history major, I'm a poli-sci minor, I studied policy and international relations and so forth. I really love politics. I love policy and getting into that, really like learning about it. So every country I go to, I would kind of get into the nitty gritty of what the culture was like, right? What is the history? How does the history inform the culture? How does history inform the culture, inform the music, or inform the sports, or the likeness of how people interact with each other? So that was the education pillar, which is the mind. Then I have the exploration aspect of it. And what I've done is I've traveled quite often. Like most recently, I did the half Ironman. And part of what I like to do is to kind of really get a sense of going and pushing your bounds. I love exercise. I love fitness. And even though I'm in my 40s, to me, being healthy, being fit is so, so important. So part of my travel experiences, it's running in every country. And so I've run in every country I've gone to in the last 8 years. So I've run in about 100 countries. And that kind of also informs the exploration part, which is the body. And then finally, there's the soul. And the soul is the culture, the music, the sports, the food. And so each one of these countries that I go to really kind of harps on each one of those aspects: mind, body, and soul, exploration, entertainment, and education. So that is has been my focus, and my travels have become a lot more intentional. And so if you ask me the first question, which is what is my style? My style is shorter, but far, far more intentional, because I really want to get the exploration, the entertainment, and the education aspects. So I plan my trips much better. I think about who I'm going to meet. And then when I land, I do leave things to chance. It's not just always pre-planned. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that too, Razvan, is because I'm limited by time and I'm limited by budget. And when you're limited by time and you're limited by budget, you're kind of screwed, because you're sitting there trying to get to a location and you can't like spend a fortune to do it because you're just limited by how much you have. You can't take a helicopter and fly to base camp of Everest. You've got to walk it, right? You can't just hire a driver for a week because it's going to cost a lot of money. And if you're traveling, and I try to go to about 7 to 9 new countries a year, or like 20 countries total a year, it gets expensive. So you've got to be very, very careful and very resourceful, which is the
Yeah.
exciting part of it. You have to kind of think out of the box. How are you going to do it? How are you going to negotiate? And it makes it very interesting. So some of my trips, I've had to be very cautious about how I do it, but very intentional. So when I come back, I've got all the content and I put together the story, and then I give it to a video editor who puts it together, and we produce the content that we have on our YouTube account.
Yeah, I could say that I didn't know about it. I had a look quickly, and I can tell you it's an amazing channel. Everyone that watches this podcast, I would suggest to have a look. It's a really good done channel, and quite yeah, quite extensive if you ask me, because you just said that you recently started, and I believe that you're gonna cover all these experiences that you're gonna have throughout this last 50 countries before you
And
finish
I'll
it.
tell you this too, Razvan. Like some of them, I kind of wanted to make it more personal. Like this one, where I went to Geneva to see where I was born, the exact
Hmm.
location. Some of them, I had like crazy experiences, and I was very fortunate to get to capture them. Like in Namibia, I went to the World Cups. I've been to like 7 World Cups. That's very important to me. I love going to the World Cups. So I try to
Oh,
capture that
amazing.
here as well. Yeah. So I mean, some of them have really been incredible, and it's really helped me connect with people because, and this is weird to say, I have to say, and I have to admit it, when I used to travel, I wouldn't be as proactive engaging the local population. I just wouldn't. I would go through the flow, go through the motions, maybe meet with a local friend, someone who lives there, do it on my own and leave. But since I've started the channel, it's forced me to meet locals, because it's near impossible to have the same experience if you do it on your own, even if you have a plan, even if you paid for a guide. It's so much more interactive and multidimensional when you see it through someone else's eyes. For example, like this guy, I met him. He was just a taxi driver. He became my guide for 3 days. We traveled together, right? Some other people here, like you can see this guy, he became a friend of mine in Mongolia, and he took me all across the country to the steppes of Mongolia, right? Again, I never expected that to happen, right? Just on and on of different places, different people that I met along the way that made the experiences just so much better. And I think that's very, very important when you travel.
Yeah, I'm actually happy. I don't know if you're reading my mind or not. I have a ton of questions that you already answered. I might need to get. I would love to dig into some topics, but we're also a bit limited in time. But you're just mentioning now about these encounters throughout the travels. I mean, do you have any
Yeah.
particular one that it really changed or made a lasting impression on you? For example, like you
Yeah,
briefly mentioned some of them, but something that it really, let's say, changed.
sure. I'd like to mention 2 off the top of my head. The first is in Namibia. In the video in Namibia, you can see it when you go to the channel. It was just magical. I went there in January, not this January, like a year or 2 years ago, and I went by myself during COVID. The friend I was going to go with didn't end up going with me. He canceled because he got COVID, and so I ended up going by myself and renting a car and going all through these incredible sand dunes. And it was during a very rainy period, and it was a low season. So I would go miles and miles without seeing a single human being. And I remember there was this funny. I was listening to a book while I was traveling called the 40 Rules. No, I think the 40 or the 50 Rules of Love, and it was an interconnection between Shams Tabrizi and Rumi. And it was such a beautiful book. And as I was traveling through the country, I'm listening to this audible and just taking it all in. Absolutely, absolutely. I can't even describe to you waking up at sunrise, hiking to the top of the dune, seeing it from above, completely on your own, like nothing next to you, and pushing yourself and getting up there and seeing it and taking it all in. You can't compare those moments, because it's like the whole world is there for you, but you're so vulnerable because you're so small in such a vastness. It's like those people have agoraphobia when they just see so much vastness, it freaks them out. Same thing here. You're like in the middle of this nothingness and it gives you goosebumps. And I always find myself praying when I'm in those moments because you have such incredible gratitude. I'll add this. This is why this moment was so incredible. Right after that, I'm driving back to try to go to the coast. So I'm in the middle of the desert and I'm trying to go back to the coast on my own. And I'm driving this car and I'm going and I see a river, but it's like a waterway. The day before, there was nothing there. Now, because it had been raining so hard, it was wet and it was like a river. And I was trying to see if I can cross it. And so I got out of the car, tried it. It looked okay. So I got back in the car and started driving, and the car got swept by the river. Swept. Backwards. I was going backwards in the river, backwards. I can't see out of the back because it's all metal. It was a truck, but it was metal. It had a bonnet. And I'm literally seeing my life flash before my eyes because I could have hit something and flipped over and drowned. And it shows you the absolute, like you go from bliss, from euphoria to what could potentially be the last moment you experience because of a stupid decision I had made. And it was so frightening because it just brought everything back to reality. So that was a trip I'll never forget because, again, it showed me how cautious you have to be in those moments.
Like a beautiful dream snapped, just like that. I'm
Just like
curious.
that.
I'm amazed about this story, and I'm very curious. How did you get out of it? I mean,
well, you'll see in the
obviously
video.
some.
Yeah, you'll
Okay,
see in the
we'll
video.
leave it for that. Okay, we'll leave it for some views there.
It's right there, and there's the car stuck in there. It was crazy.
Wow.
But that was frightening and just incredible because of what happened within hours of each other. The other one I quickly want to kind of highlight that was just unbelievable for me was Kilimanjaro. The trip I had done many years ago, about 10 years ago, and I just kind of relived the moment and recorded it for audiences. And what was beautiful about it, Rizvan, is that it was really about pushing yourself so much to get to the top. You gave yourself a goal. And I wasn't just kind of going through the motions and enjoying every day and looking at the flowers. I was just, I don't know what got in my head. I'm like, I have to get to the top of that mountain without succumbing to altitude sickness, without having, getting injured, sleeping well, eating well, and so forth. And I think the moment that was so magical for me, and you asked me this question, like what really stuck out, was when I got to the top of Kilimanjaro. Because we woke up at 1 a.m. and most people take their time to get up there, maybe like 6, 7, 8, 9 hours to get to the summit. But I pushed myself because I wanted to see at sunrise. And we got there at 5:45. So like in 4 hours, 4.5 hours, we got to the summit. And I ran to the summit, even though the altitude really kind of affects you. But I ran to the summit and I just started crying, like just literally crying, sobbing, me and my friend and the porter. I don't know why. But I find myself, I have to say, admit that when you're in these moments of bliss, you thank God that you're alive. You thank God that you're seeing it and witnessing it because you know how many other people will never have that opportunity, either because they can't afford to travel, they don't have the time to travel, they're too ill to travel, or unfortunately, they died. Like I had good friends of mine that had passed away much earlier than one would have ever expected. And I know they'll never be able to see that moment. And we saw it. The sun is rising. The clouds are below you. You see the glacier. You see the crater. And you did it. You achieved it. And God gave you the ability, without you getting injured, without you getting sick, to see this moment. It's incredible. So I think those are two experiences off the top of my head I can think of that were just magical.
Yeah, I can. I mean, just by listening to you, I can transport myself over there and see all these things with eyes. I mean, I'm also thinking if you have any other spot. I mean, you mentioned these two experiences, but if you have a spot which you will go now to, you will always, let's say, to return, or an image that you will not like to erase from your mind forever. or
Mm.
never? Sorry, which one
Mm.
would that be?
Uh, I mean, there's so many moments and places that have been absolutely magical. It's funny. This is. I'll tell you this. There's something called neuro-linguistic programming, where
Yeah,
you
I know.
basically you're right. And so what they try to teach you is to say, think about a moment that brings you utter joy and happiness and serenity. Close your eyes, imagine it, and then amplify that same image in your head one time, two times, 10 times, so you feel that moment of absolute joy because you got transported back to that moment. And then they say, give yourself a physical connection to that moment and a word that triggers that moment. So what they say is hold your thumbs, squeeze your thumbs, think of that word, and it'll transport you back to that moment. And for me, I immediately was trying to think what would be that moment because there's so many that I've been to and places. And the one that immediately came to mind is actually in America. And it's actually a desert in New Mexico. And it's called White Sands, New Mexico. And the whole area is white. It's white, very fine white sands. It's a desert. And I remember it so well because it was during COVID and everything was shut down and nobody was wanting to travel. And I was there and I was witnessing and I was seeing the sun setting over this white sands. And I remember being like, you couldn't hear anything. And the sun is setting and the weather was like perfect. It was like 75 degrees, like 22 Celsius. And it just gave me like goosebumps. And I love that moment. And so I now, when I think about it, I'm like stressed out and I want to think of something that calms me down. You just squeeze the thumbs, you think of that moment, and it just brings you back there.
My God, I just Googled it. Now it's an amazing place. I
Yeah,
don't know if I knew
absolutely.
about it.
Yeah, really beautiful.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, and I'm pretty sure. I mean, like with all the experience in travel, you might have a ton of this sort of images in your mind. I
Yeah,
myself, I have same things like or some places or some images that you will never want to leave, but then you say you quickly have another glance at before leaving, and then another one, and say, okay, I'll stay for a bit more.
exactly.
But yeah, it's very difficult because indeed we are limited. We're limited by time, also financially, and so on.
Yeah.
So obviously, we probably all, as you mentioned, want to see as much as possible. And I believe that you having this the channel with last 50 countries, I believe that you aim to see all countries, all UN countries in the world, correct?
Yeah, I mean, the goal is I want to see, I have about 37 countries left. So 100, I've been to 160, so I have about 37 left. And the goal is to try to travel to about 7 to 8 new countries a year so that I can finish it, in the next 4 to 5 years and see the world. I'm not trying to rush it too much, like those people that travel and go to like 50 countries in a year. And, I don't have that time. And I really want to appreciate those moments as much as I can while also being realistic about life, right? You have to make money, spending time with loved ones, and so forth. So it does make it difficult. But I'll tell you this, Razvan, one of the things that, as I was going through this, and even thinking about this interview, is one of the things I always think about is stay curious. To me, if you stay curious, everything else in your life, at least in how your brain works, will continue functioning. You won't, I hope, ever succumb to dementia, Alzheimer, brain disease, if you stay curious. To stay curious, you need to be motivated and determined. And I think that's what I have as a blessing from God, is that I'm curious, I'm determined, and I have a lot of energy, a lot of it. And those have been gifts from God because I was able to kind of channel that to travel. And because I'm constantly staying curious, you'll find me on Wikipedia or in Google every day asking questions constantly. If I have a question I can't think of, I'm like, what does that mean? Boom, quickly Google it. And then I just remember it constantly. And that really helps you when you travel. At a minimum, I go to the Wikipedia page of every country I go to before I go. So I look about the economics, the politics, the history, the culture, the geography, right? And quickly read up on that. Then I start looking at it. I start blogging and taking a look what other people have done. Then I quickly get caught up in a Wikipedia whirlpool, right? Like a rabbit hole. And I start reading about the history. And so when I get there, oh, you go from seeing a
Yeah.
country in black and white to seeing a country in three-dimensional.
Yep.
So
And
it
on
really
top of
is,
that, the experiences that you have there, and I mean, it all builds up, and you'll probably have a great image of their life and people and so on. But
exactly.
sometimes I'm also thinking that maybe too much preparation is not the greatest. They say. I mean, I
Uh-huh.
love to. Lately, I also research quite a lot and I read a lot. I think it's mostly because I have a family life and I don't travel as much. That before I just dive in and I went many times without knowing anything about the
Yeah.
place, and that also gives you an impression, like a totally fresh image, or wow sentiment all the time,
Yeah.
whereas now more people we meet, the more social network, the bigger the social network grows, especially from the traveler side. It's getting rare and rare to find about places, or I don't know, people that or tribes or festivals and so on that you maybe have heard for the first time, so but this would be this white sands, for me at least, was is one of the examples that I didn't know, but
Yeah.
it's always interesting to see new ones, although this social media, I think, and how can I call it, and this internet era diminishes that a bit. I
It
mean,
does.
dilutes it a bit.
I think that's exactly right. And I think spontaneity in travel is extremely important. So you have to balance being spontaneous as well as not missing out on opportunities. I remember, for example, I'd been to Bolivia. I never heard of the salt flats, the Salar de Uyuni, right? I'd never heard of it.
I,
And I
I
went to
can imagine
Bolivia.
when once you've been there,
Yeah. And I
seeing it
know, I
for the
went
first
there
time.
and I never saw it and I left. And then years later, I'd seen it and I'm like, wow, how did I miss this? And then I went back to Bolivia to see it. But the reality is, there's something beautiful about being spontaneous. And a lot of my trips, I would find the person, the guide, in a hotel that I check into, or in the tourist office, or in the street. And then they show you a whole new part, and you take your itinerary and you throw it away and you go with
Yeah,
the flow. So
exactly.
it does kind of cut both ways.
And it happens. I mean, I'm not going to copyright this, but it happens many times. You have a plan, an itinerary, or things that you want to see, you heard about before, and so on, and then just the local then recommends you something that totally new, and your jaw drops, or I mean, like you say, just scrap everything and just
With the
go with the
flow.
flow.
Exactly.
So yeah, all this, I think, a combination of all these things, it's really healthy. Obviously, now staying curious, it's a blessing, and then having also the tools now to research, or even to talk with other peers, other people, that other travelers, like it helps a lot.
Yeah.
Listening to podcasts and all these sort of
Yeah.
interviews, you'll get never ending stories, I would
Never.
believe. And I think we could talk a ton on this. I don't know if we have too much time here, but I think we could maybe wrap up with one last question, or one of
Sure.
the last few. Um, Maybe I'll leave that at the end, but there's I wanted to ask you if you have a particular moment which you consider a turning point in your life. But you already mentioned a couple of them, and I think that, I mean, it's maybe if it's not one of them, then would be a repetition. But you mentioned the Namibian incident, also the time travel that you moved to the US and got US citizenship. But I was more maybe focused exactly on the traveling side. And
Sure. Yeah, I'll give you one that I think was very profound, that in many ways was a turning point. Um, I was around 30, 31, and I had never been to Iraq. So I'd already traveled to about 95 countries, but never to my country of origin, which was for people that are like, what?
insane.
You've been to the most random places in the world, but you haven't even been to Iraq. And I'm like, I hadn't been. Uh, it was 2011. And I had the opportunity to train speakers for TED, for the TED Talks, for TEDx in Baghdad. For it was the first time. And I remember going to my father and saying, listen, this is an opportunity. They've invited me to come to train these speakers. I'm going to be in a secure location. Can I go? And I didn't necessarily need his permission. I was in my 30s, but I just wanted them to feel comfortable. And so he said, go. And I went to Iraq for the first time. And I remember that so distinctly because I met family there I'd never met in my life. I ate food that I had only seen and been heard about, and finally had it. And I was there helping these Iraqis, training them to be able to deliver their talk on the TED stage. And it was just unbelievably profound. And seeing Iraq for the first time and walking in the streets. And I haven't done it since. I've been back to Iraq many times, but working with the US government, which is restricted to a certain location. But that was the only time I've walked around the streets as a civilian. And I hope to go back with my mother and explore Iraq more as an Iraqi, because I think there's something really profound about going back to your roots. And I have to say that moment was such a turning point because of that, it changed kind of my career trajectory. I went from just being a lawyer to being an international development lawyer working with the US government, because I felt that it was important to have people, Iraqis, working as an Iraqi-American between America and Iraq, rather than just Americans, like people have never spoken Arabic or been to the country or know anything about it, representing America with Iraq. So it's important to have a hyphenated identity. It also opened my eyes to try to go back to graduate school. And I did a master's in public administration after that experience. I've volunteered in every election, US presidential election, to help get out the vote. You know, like I became much more involved in civic engagement at that moment when I went to Iraq, because I really embraced myself as an Iraqi and as an American. I think that was very important for me. So it was a huge turning point personally and in terms of my travel.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it's amazing that I didn't expect actually to have another answer, since you already mentioned this before, a few turning points. So you might have already a few throughout your experience, but this is indeed, it's really important. And I was curious, which part of Iraq your family comes from?
The North, they're Kurdish. So my
From Kurdistan.
family's from Kurdistan. So originally all Kurdish for many, 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 many years and generations. But I haven't been to the Kurdish North, and so I'm excited to go there with my mother at some point soon.
Oh, nice. So you've been to Iraq, but not to Kurdistan region.
No, just Baghdad.
Nice. Well, I'm sure you'll enjoy it. I was there, or as I was only there, only in Kurdistan,
Oh,
and
very nice.
I don't know. I would be curious to see the rest, the south, obviously, with all this history.
Yes.
It's an amazing country. Uh, You've now you talked a lot about travel, and maybe you mentioned you mentioned a bit of the things that you're gonna do after you finish 193, being curious and so on. You also mentioned that you love to watch the World Cups, the football World
Mhm.
Cups, and also participate lately on this Ironman contest. Would this be a continuation in your travel, let's say, journey? Like, continue to do this until the day you cannot move, or
Yeah.
you'll obviously you might discover some new things that you want to do, or you want to focus on different things. Can you share something?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I think it's funny because you look at they say there's more people that have been to space than every country in the world. And it's interesting when people accomplish this life goal, and then what do they do? What's next? I was reading some of the blogs and watching the vlogs that you guys have posted about people who've gone through that motion. And there's no definitive answer. Some people leave and they come back and they start a company related to it, start a podcast, write a book. Um, I'm probably just like anyone else. I couldn't tell you 100% what I want to do. I know that I probably will live abroad. I have, and I will probably continue. I probably will continue traveling. I couldn't tell you if I'm going to start going to every territory or stuff like that. There's a lot of countries I would go back to that I'm excited to go back to and spend more time there. But there isn't a definitive. I think doing a podcast like this, I would love to, because I love talking to people and learning about their experiences. Continue doing these vlogs, I think, is fun. But I'm not a spring chicken. I don't think anybody's going to want to see someone in their 60s and 70s and 80s still vlogging. So who knows what happens when they get older. But
But
so far, yeah, it's been amazing.
yeah, who knows what might appear? Maybe some things that we don't even know about at this point. But hopefully, we'll
Exactly.
stay healthy and live long enough to
Enjoy it.
them and enjoy them. I mean, in just a few months, just around the corner here, the World Cup is coming. So I hope we see each other in Germany then.
For
I
the
don't know if
Euro
you
Cup.
come.
For the Euro Cup,
It's a
yes.
Euro Cup, yes. Oh, sorry. Well, it shows how big of a fan I am. I'm more actually,
Yeah.
I'm more of a basketball fan, and I know a lot about NBA, for example. And
Very
I'd
nice.
love
Yeah.
to come one time to one of the four teams you have in California, see a game.
I was going to say, come and enjoy the Lakers or the Clippers or the Kings or
Kings or Golden State.
the Golden State Warriors are all here in California for you.
Nice. You're blessed with this, I think. Uh, and now, since we're getting to the 50 minutes mark, I said like we just wanna, and since your blog is called Final 50, we can wrap it up, I would say, even though we can continue, I think, after. It's amazing talk. I love to talk about travel, and obviously, it's by far you can see that you have this passion as well. If you would have the chance to spend let's say a dinner, invite three famous people, dead or alive,
Mhm.
who would you bring to the table, or who you invite them? With
Uh, so I would say the first, and I don't usually think about these questions, but I know that you guys had asked me and I wanted to kind of think through it. I'd say the first person would be Ibn Battuta, which is weird. People are like, who's Ibn Battuta? Well, he was one of the most well-traveled individuals in history. He had actually traveled far more than Marco Polo. But as history is written by the victors, Marco Polo got all the attention. Ibn Battuta didn't, but he traveled from Spain all the way to along the Silk Route and so forth, through Africa and along the Silk Route. A really incredible person. And I thought to myself, what an amazing source of inspiration to meet someone like him, especially given how much I love to travel. So kind of what inspired him to do it and what he discovered on his journeys, because they were doing it by camel. The second person I would have to say would be Da Vinci, because this guy is the Renaissance man. I mean, this guy was inventing ways of painting, even though he didn't paint as often as one would imagine. I mean, he was the one who kind of drew up a prototype for a helicopter. He put together the Vitruvian Man, right, in terms of
yeah,
biology and anatomy. I mean, this man was something like even in like he was such a Renaissance figure at such a pivotal time in history, and being a lover of history. And the fact that the guy lived, I think, to his 70s or 80s, you could learn so much from someone so humble, having seen and achieved so much under so many different monarchies. And as a lover of history and as someone who likes to think of himself as a Renaissance person, I think he would be a fascinating individual to meet. And I'd say the
still
third
have more.
person, yeah, the third person I would have to say is alive, and it would be Obama. And the reason for that is living in America. and you see how divisive this country is today and how much it's been on the right and the wrong side of history. Obama for us was so important. And I remember going and campaigning for him and knocking on doors in 2008. And I remember when he won, it was such a moving experience for me, that a man like him with his background could achieve something like presidency. And I would cry just thinking about that speech that he gave when he actually accepted that he became president in Chicago. I ask anybody to go back and listen to that speech because it was so incredibly moving from where we were then to where we are now. And he was so important in my life trajectory because I ended up working for the US government, even though I was against the war in Iraq, 100% against it. I ended up working for the US government because I believed in him. I believed in the mission. And so for me to meet someone like Obama and hear from him, somebody so inspirational, so well-spoken, that had came from for such a humble beginning, would just fill my heart with joy because it's probably one of the most inspiring speakers I've ever met. And as someone who's really loves politics and policy, he's just someone that I look up to very, very much. So I guess those would be the three people.
Great. Well, I think it would definitely be an interesting evening, an amazing one. Hopefully they'll have nice personalities.
And they'd get along.
Yeah, that's also very important. Well, thanks a lot, Hamada. It was a really nice pleasure chatting with you. Love to hear a ton of your from your travels and experiences. I'll probably go through your videos, all of them, and I recommend everyone listening to this to do the same. I thank you again, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much, Razvan, and thank you to NomadMania for allowing me to have this opportunity to speak about my love for travel.
Thank you.
Take care.